to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Elaine Pagels. Elaine is a historian of religion and a professor at Princeton University. She's the author of many books, including the Gnostic Gospels, Beyond Belief, The Secret Gospel of Thomas, and Why Religion? A Personal Story. In 2016, she was awarded the National Medal for the Arts from then US President Barack Obama. She's a leading expert on the Gnostic Gospels and early Christianity, which is what we talk about today. Hope you enjoy the conversation.
Okay, so before we start, just can you give me a little background of what interests you about this work?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what is your field?
So I'm in neuroscience, but I initially studied psychology as an undergraduate, and then specialized more and more in the kind of brain side of things. But my initial interest in this stuff came from, as a teenager, I was raised Catholic, but then I had it was actually when I was wrestling with a crisis of faith. I couldn't get over the level of metaphysical threat that there was around kind of original sin and the prospect of hell. And I was about 13 years old, and it was really, I was overly conscientious as a child, and it was really bothering me. And it effectively, the way I think about it now, is it effectively kind of baffled my rational mind, like in Zen Buddhism, where they have these koans, these paradoxes that are intended to disrupt the rational mind. And I had this amazing experience of just utter serenity and it was just the most profound experience of my life. And it just came from having this kind of silent mind experience. And from that moment on, I was very interested in the mind, but also in kind of spiritual experience. And I've tended to go down the route of understanding it naturalistically through science. So I'm very interested in mysticism of all religious kind of types. So I've interviewed kind of experts on Buddhism, and I've spoken to a few people on Christianity, and an amazing rabbi on Jewish mysticism. So yeah, I'm kind of exploring myself, because I'm not a religious scholar, but.
Well, that's very interesting. I thought of studying neuroscience in college too,
Oh, really?
but at that point, it was at such a different level. It was,
Right.
how the brain perceives red and green, and I thought, no, this is too slow. I mean, now neuroscience is very much more interesting, and cognitive psychology, which fascinates me too. But I thought studying the traditions themselves would be illuminating in different ways. So that's what I did. But if you saw the latest book, Why Religion? I forget whether you mentioned it. It does talk about that, but also, and then I'm sure we'll talk about this, religion as experience, as the kind of experience you had,
Right,
not
exactly.
as a set of cognitive beliefs.
Yeah, that was the the thing that was liberating. I mean, in that experience, I was immediately released from all concerns around dogma. I suddenly felt that there were deep kind of experiential spiritual truths that you can discover yourself, but I didn't need to worry about other people telling me scary stories. Really, it was just like, okay, these are just things people are telling me. These are words, these are ideas, but the real
Yes,
thing is
yes,
something you discover yourself, that's not really, is kind of beyond words and ideas, I would say.
exactly. And as you see, when I discovered the Gospel of Thomas, I said, okay, this makes sense to me, not the other.
Right. So maybe we can begin with a bit of your background, how you became interested in Christianity in the first place.
Well, like many people these days, I was brought up in a secular family. It was nominally Christian, but my father had given up the kind of ferocious Presbyterianism of his family for Darwin as soon as he encountered science. And he said, well, obviously, these stories are just silly old folk tales. Who needs that? Only ignorant people would be religious. So he just dismissed the whole thing as something that only uneducated people would have any interest in. And yet I love poetry and music and dance and all kinds of um, creative expressions that are very traditionally grew out of religious traditions, ancient ones, native ones, you know, Christian, Jewish, all of them, Muslim, grew, they developed a great deal of poetry and music and ritual and all of the forms of imaginative exploration. So I loved those, but I never knew until I was 14. I wrote about this that I was living in what I thought was a very boring town, Palo Alto in California, where Stanford University is. My father was on the faculty doing biology. And somebody said, let's go to San Francisco. Well, I thought anything in San Francisco would be more interesting than Palo Alto on a sleepy Sunday afternoon. So I went. What I didn't know, James, is that we were going to a Billy Graham crusade, a crusade for Christ. And that was alien to my background. But there in the sports stadium where I'd seen baseball games played, enormous, like 20,000 people, they were there to see this preacher. And he spoke very powerfully in many ways. And I was very moved by the music and the power of the speech and what he said. And so when the altar call came, I just thought, yes, I'm going down. I'm going to be born again. At 14, that seemed an irresistible invitation to start all over and have a different life. And so I did. And I joined an evangelical church. For about a year, I was intensely involved. And then I had to leave that church.
That I wonder if that's an interesting form of rebellion. If you have parents who are secular, do you think that was part of it?
I do think that was part of it. All the other side of it is that, a world in which rationalism is the highest form of understanding felt kind of like a flat earth. It's there wasn't another dimension, which I didn't know how to articulate. I wouldn't have known what a spiritual dimension was then. But that preaching opened up something that I felt was very powerful, which has to do with the imagination and has to do with the way we understand ourselves, in terms of poetry or visions or whatever.
Yeah, I think I like that, the way you put
So,
that, and I tend to think of science as kind of a map, but lived experience is the territory. So science and rationalism by itself is a bit dry, but the real stuff can be discovered through spiritual experience. So yeah, I like the way you put that.
well, I like the way Einstein put it. He said you really need both. And,
Hmm.
later I married a theoretical physicist, a wonderful person, who said to me initially, why religion? I mean, why don't you do something with impact in the real world? I said, why do you study elementary particles? I mean, what, they're invisible, you can't see them. I mean, what difference does it make? And we both realized we were interested in finding out something fundamental about the world we live in. And he came to enjoy the fact that I was studying religion, thinking about it, not just sort of caught in it as a kind of preacher, but I went to a secular university on purpose so that I could ask the questions I needed to ask.
Right. And was it when you were a teenager and you wrote about a car crash in which a friend died that was kind of pivotal for your relationship with this evangelical church?
Yes, it was. I mean, that's how I suddenly was precipitated out of that church as suddenly as I'd been precipitated into it. It was an accident following a party in Palo Alto in which people were driving too fast, and one of my closest friends, who was 16 years old, was crushed when the car turned over. And in it, there were two other friends of ours. One was a musician, Jerry Garcia, and another was his close friend, Alan Trist, who was actually on a gap year from Westminster School right before he would go back to Cambridge University. And he had oddly become a friend of Jerry Garcia, who was a Latino street kid, sort of just out of the army, with a great gift for music. And they became very unlikely buddies and traveled around together and enjoyed each other. And so then I went back to my evangelical church, brokenhearted because our friend had been killed in the crash, a very extraordinary person. And my evangelical friend said, "That's terrible. Was he born again?" And I said, "No, he was Jewish." And they said, "Well, then he's in hell." And I felt like I had been sort of socked in the stomach. And I thought, well, wasn't Jesus Jewish? What are you talking about? This was supposed to be about God's love. It has nothing to do with what you just said. So I just walked out of there and felt utterly desolated. I never went back. And it was years before I ever approached Christianity again. But when I did, it was not looking for faith. I was trying to say, what hit me then? What was it about those traditions that seemed to open up a dimension of experience that I hadn't even known existed? How did it start? How did the story of Jesus give birth to these institutions, which claim to know everything about him and claim to offer the only route to salvation, whatever they mean by that? So I wanted to understand the history. Like you, I wanted to take a secular approach and did.
Right. And
Behind it, there was a spiritual quest involved, but I wasn't going to take that route.
and is it right that that car crash is where the band The Grateful Dead get their name from?
Yes, in fact, I was talking to someone, to Terry Gross, on her program in the States called Fresh Air, about the crash. And I said that 5 years after the accident, Jerry Garcia started a band. I was in graduate school by then, but he started this band and he called it the Grateful Dead. And I thought, oh, that must be because he and Alan nearly got killed. And then somebody called up Alan Trist. By that time, Jerry had died. That was just a couple of years ago. And called up Alan Trist and said, some woman on radio was talking about how the band got their name, but that's not what happened. We know the story. And he said, you don't know the story, because it really was about the car crash. Jerry had said that was something that transformed his life, made him serious about his music. And after that, Alan Trist went back from Cambridge University studying anthropology to become the music publisher for the Grateful Dead for the next 35 years.
Wow. And with that generation, there were a lot of people, I guess, becoming interested in mysticism and kind of looking east, because Christianity seemed at least, from the mainstream version of Christianity, seemed to lack that mysticism, right? Even in Judaism, there's kind of Kabbalah, and in Islam, there's kind of Sufi practices. There are these mystical strands, but I think a lot of people kind of turned to Buddhism, Hinduism, when they had these mystical experiences in the 60s to find some framework. But I guess what we'll be talking about today is these Gnostic traditions, right, that did exist, it seems, within Christianity, but were suppressed.
Yes, exactly. I mean, what we knew about Christianity, and you would know this, of course, is that it was mainly, do you believe in God? Do you believe in Jesus as the Son of God? What do you believe? So it's a set of beliefs, it's a code of beliefs that was created, of course, in the 4th century, long after the death of Jesus. There was a Christian movement for 300 years before there was that kind of a creed. And as you suggested, I mean, that had very little to do with the experiences that people sought as genuinely transformative of our lives, because those had not been the focus of Orthodox Christianity. But when I went to graduate school at Harvard, suddenly I discovered there were many more gospels than we had ever known there were. They were all called heresy. And they were buried for nearly 2,000 years and found unexpectedly in a find in Upper Egypt in a cave. And those texts spoke to a very different dimension, just as you suggest.
And those texts are the Nag Hammadi library, is that right?
We call them that because they were found in a collection probably taken out of a monastery in the 4th century in the monastery library and hidden because the archbishop have said, okay, there are only 4 gospels that are genuine gospels. The rest of them are all heresy, which actually means choice. And choice was something the bishops didn't think was too good for people. So they shouldn't choose. They should listen to what we say. What's different? And we kept asking ourselves immediately, what's different about these other gospels that they censored, buried, burned, trashed, and basically had disappeared for 2,000? So I started to read the Gospel of Thomas. And I was very struck by a saying, it said, Jesus says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. And I thought, you don't have to believe that. It's just true. But I took it psychologically. And I think it works on that level. And later I understood it was also a theological statement about a connection with the divine source within each person, which could become a way to find access to that source by oneself without an institution and before there were any of the kind that now exist.
Right. I think that's a powerful quote. And as you said, on a psychological level, it's insightful in an understanding, almost like a Jungian shadow understanding that there are parts of you that are hidden and unconscious and can drive you. I think as a quote from him was, if you don't make the unconscious conscious, it will kind of rule your life and you'll call it fate. So it's kind of acting from in the shadows and then bringing things to awareness. I think we're increasingly realizing is a core therapeutic principle. But then, as you say, I think the kind of the radiance of when we look inwards and we have these spiritual experiences, the light of consciousness is kind of in which everything's beheld. There's a lot of references to light, I think, in kind of mystical literature, right? And so I think you're right, on the spiritual, theological level, it also holds.
Yes, I mean, takes a long time to sort of discover these texts because they're told in koans or sort of provocative statements, wisdom statements. And I do think really that they are probably connected with Jewish mystical thought. And one major difference between the Gospels in the New Testament and those that were discovered in that find is that the ones in the New Testament suggest that Jesus of Nazareth is utterly unique in the history of the world. He is connected with the divine in a way that no one else ever has been or will be, except through him. And that kind of teaching became useful for constructing an Orthodox church that said outside the church there is no salvation. But the Gospel of Thomas suggests that Jesus spoke about being connected with the divine source, and really in terms of the Hebrew Bible, that we are all created in the image of God. And because you can't make an image of God in traditional Judaism, it's forbidden. The only image which is allowed is one that the prophets articulated in words. They talked about, for example, Ezekiel, when he talks about being carried up into heaven and seeing the Lord. What did he see? He said, I saw a throne and something like a human being, but it wasn't a human being. I saw jewels and lightning and fire and brilliant glory shining. I saw light pouring out. So light became the image you could use for the God of the Hebrew Bible. And in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus speaks of that light as the source from which the universe comes. It's a metaphor for energy, for divine energy from which the world came into being. And then Jesus says, you probably know in the Gospel of Thomas, I am the light that is before all things. I am all things. All things come forth from me. All things return to me. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up a rock, and you will find me. So it's as though this whole universe, I'm looking out at the mountains now, and the stars and the wilderness in Colorado, that all of this came forth from some source which is beyond our comprehension, but which can only be described as light, and that we came forth from that source too. And that's why we have access, a kind of light within us, as the Quakers would later say, the inner light. I think George Fox had the same kind of insight when he founded the Quaker movement,
Right.
that there was something within you or any of us that could connect you with that source.
And there's also a line I saw you reference in a lecture, something to do with, maybe it's from the same passage even in Gospel of Thomas, about Jesus saying he is the thing that existed before it existed. Does that ring a bell? It's
Yes,
yeah,
yes. It talks about talking about the kingdom of God and saying, what is the kingdom of God that Jesus
right,
said was coming? Well, people today will say, well, it's the end time, or maybe it's the church, or maybe it's come or something. I mean, how do you interpret that? But the Gospel of Thomas says, don't look at the end of time and say, when will the kingdom of God come? Go back to the beginning. In fact, you have to go back before the beginning of time. And you say, well, how do you go back before the beginning? Well, any rabbi could say, well, you read Genesis, of course, and it talks about what happened before the beginning, that when God first spoke, he said, let there be light. But that is a metaphor for the divine energy that created the world, because that's before there was a world. So that's what these rabbis would have seen in the Gospel of Thomas. And you know, Kabbalah, which you mentioned, wasn't really written down until Sephardic Jewish communities wrote certain powerful books, usually dated to the 11th to the 15th century of the Common Era. I mean, you weren't supposed to talk about mystical teaching because it could give immature people an inflated idea, well, I'm God, or some kind of foolishness. So they said, well, you have to just speak it to people who are mature enough to understand. But the secret gospel, like Thomas, I think, is an articulation of Jewish mystical teaching, and it claims that Jesus knew that teaching and taught it privately. Because the New Testament Gospels, as you know, are all about what Jesus taught in public, thousands of people sitting on the hillside, and he's preaching in public. But Mark says he also taught secretly to his disciples. And the Gospels in the New Testament usually don't tell you anything about secret teaching. But the Gospel of Thomas claims that in secret, Jesus of Nazareth knew about Jewish mystical teaching, which was probably thousands of years old before it was actually written in a form that we now have. And
right.
there are some professors of Kabbalah at the Hebrew University who endorse that view, because, so I began to think, maybe what they called heresy was really Jewish mystical thought very often.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned the idea of secret teachings versus the public teachings, and this seems to be something that we see in all religions, right? That there's the exoteric teachings for everyone at the congregation, and then the esoteric instructions for the initiates, the ones who are responsible enough or skilled enough to really have to go all the way, I guess, with their own personal experience. And so do you think that's the division between the orthodox mainstream view was when the exoteric public teachings became formalized, and everything esoteric and to do with kind of initiation and these private or
Yes.
secret traditions were the ones that were ostracized.
Yes, just as you say, there's not a religion we can think of. I mean, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, that doesn't have a distinct recognition of a sort of elementary basic teaching. Usually it's about behavior, it's about what you do and what you don't do. It's about halakha in Judaism, it's about Torah. And then a deeper teaching, which has to do with dimensions of experience that go beyond that. And and the secret gospels, see, at first we thought in graduate school, well, they're the good gospels and the bad ones. I mean, the bishop said, these are the true gospels, four gospels, now they're in the New Testament. These others are garbage, so just don't read them. They're bad for you, they'll lead you astray. But now we understand that, and it took a while figuring out because these gospels had been so denounced, denigrated, censored, um, that we just, my professor said at the time, we just thought these things were weird. Well, they are kind of weird, but we finally realized that they're not meant to be replacements of the stories in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're meant to be an advanced level that can be taught subsequently. But the bishop said, no, there's only this, there's no secret teaching, stop that. Because if you're an institutional leader, you can't control what people say Jesus taught secretly. I mean, you could make up something different and contrary to Catholic teaching. And so in Orthodox Christianity, whether Catholic or Protestant, if you're going to call yourself a mystic, like Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross, you better sound a lot like Orthodoxy because you are in danger of the Inquisition. You're in danger of being called a heretic yourself.
I mean, as someone who really believes in the importance of direct mystical experience, I'm not inclined to dismiss them as just weird, as you say, some people are. But as I was reading the Gospel of Thomas, I was definitely struck by a kind of tone of strangeness. It felt kind of just certain passages seemed kind of odd. And at first I thought, well, this was maybe something special about these Gospels. But then I was reflecting on all of the passages I'm familiar with from a Christian upbringing, and just the sacrament, the body and blood of Christ. Right? If you were to hear that with fresh ears, that sounds quite odd. That's not the kind of thing you hear in everyday life, right? So part of me was like, okay, maybe they're not particularly strange. It's just I'm hearing them with fresh ears, and we've got this sanitized version of it now where we're all used to we're told what it represents and all this other stuff. But yeah, I think when people turn to these texts, they can be surprised by some of the strangeness there.
Yes. Well, there's a lot of strangeness in Christianity. But, I've been recently rereading the Gospel of Mark. It's one of my favorites. And, it's the shortest and the earliest one we have, and Matthew and Luke are based on it. And it looks like a simple narrative, but it's not. In fact, there was an extraordinary British critic, Frank Kermode, who wrote a book called The Sense of a Beginning about the Gospel of Mark. And he understood this looks like a naive text, just Jesus doing miracles. And, it's strange, but it's actually very subtle. And many of the miracles described are metaphors for things that are hidden in the text, and even things that Jesus probably hid himself. So there's a lot more mystery and secrecy in the text we have than we ordinarily recognize. People think, oh, this is pretty forthright, Jesus does a miracle and he's obviously God. But traditions are not that simple.
Right. And you said that Mark was the earliest, but is there, I know there's a debate about how old the Gospel of Thomas is, but is there a possibility that it's even earlier than Mark?
We don't know, it's so hard to date any of these. We think not even that Mark was the earliest, because Luke said many people were writing about Jesus at the time, but it's the earliest narrative that survives. Right? And it's written maybe 40 or 50 years after the death of Jesus. So when I was in graduate school, my professor thought, well, the earliest memories of Jesus wouldn't so much be stories and narrative, it would be sayings. Like Jesus said, the parable of the mustard seed, or that Jesus told the story of a treasure hidden in the field. These are little, they call them pericopes, meaning a sort of a little piece of the teaching. And so to find a text that was just sayings, that's what scholars always assumed would have been the earliest, that there would be lists of the sayings of Jesus. And that's what most scholars assume were the earliest written sources. So to find a source that was nothing but sayings struck him as possibly earlier. We don't know, though, because it seems to me that we have evidence that the Gospel of Thomas is written, at least it had been written by the time, the end of the first century, by the time, say, the Gospel of John had been written, or maybe earlier, but we don't know. Scholars who really don't like this material, and I can mention a prominent scholar at Cambridge University who has written massive commentaries on the Gospel of Thomas to prove how derivative it is and how insignificant. It's all dependent on the other Gospels. And people who say that, this is Simon Gathercole at Cambridge University, people who say that will always say, well, and also, of course, the Gospel of Thomas is written very late, because the actual texts we have that were found in Upper Egypt were written in the 3rd and 4th century. Well, totally irrelevant, because what we have, the texts, are papyrus copies in Coptic, ancient Egyptian, of what was a Greek source written far earlier, and we have pieces, fragments of the Greek source that were found in Oxyrhynchus in Upper Egypt in garbage dumps, along where you can also find fragments of the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Mark. So it looks really quite early, but we don't know the dates, and that doesn't really guarantee much anyway. But there is the important thing, I think, is that scholars really divide on this. Some, like me, find it say, wait, this really expands our perspective on the early Christian movement, and it explains a lot of things that we had no clue about. And others, like Gathercole, will say, oh, secondary derivative, ignore this stuff. All we really should care about is what the Orthodox Church endorses. And Orthodox, in Greek means straight thinking. So they have the straight thinking Gospels, or so they claim.
That perspective to me seems to place a lot of trust in the, I guess, the theological motivations of the people in power who chose the Gospels that were to become canonical. So as you have people like Emperor Constantine, I'm assuming is a relevant figure here. And in my mind, I've assumed
Yes.
as the emperor of the Roman Empire, the state religion would serve some functional purpose. They wouldn't just be choosing these things because out of some purely theological sense of what was most appropriate, but instead as having some social consequences. So yeah, if people think that they just got it 100% right and everything that's in the canon is great and everything that's not is bad, that it strikes me as naive.
Well, I tend to agree with you. I mean, Constantine, I think, there's a lot of debates about his motive in becoming a Christian, or at least a patron of Christianity, since he wasn't baptized until he was nearly dying, because there wasn't a view that you could have sins forgiven after baptism. So an emperor would have to wait until he was on his deathbed so he wouldn't commit any more sins, which would be necessary for an emperor, like having people killed. But his interest was also, and his assumption is that the state endorses a religion. I mean, religion and politics are completely intertwined in the Roman Empire. They didn't even have a word to separate them. So when he became a Christian, he didn't outlaw paganism initially, but he certainly felt that it was his duty as emperor to pour money into the right churches, the Orthodox churches, which had the best networks for communication throughout an enormous empire that was beyond the capacity of any single emperor to manage. Right? There had been a tetrarchy, four emperors trying to control different areas of this vast territory that the Roman Empire was. But when he was the sole emperor of the whole world, and he took the Orthodox churches with their institutionalized organization patterned after the Roman army, right? So there are generals and three orders of authority in the army, and the Catholic Church adopted those three as bishops, priests, and deacons. Same structure. And then you had a very organized church. If you were the bishop, you would have, levels of priests below you who are under your authority, and below them, the ones called diaconoi, which means the helpers, the servants. So you would have an administrative bureaucracy that could amplify the necessities of the empire. You could now get money from imperial churches. You could judge cases when you don't have enough courts to deal with all the cases that need to be adjudicated. So you would become effectively part of the imperial administration in a Christian Roman Empire eventually. That was after Constantine. It took about 50, 60, 70, 80 years for that process to be completed and put into, the legal codes.
Right. And so we know that Constantine's happening around the 4th century. And I think it was in the Gnostic Gospels you wrote about the kind of the church becoming more hierarchical, as you mentioned, with the kind of bishops, priests, and deacons around 200 AD. And around the same time, I think, two people, Irenaeus and Hippolytus, you say were writing about these heretical Gospels, which I guess suggests that they are at least older than 200 AD, right?
They certainly were. I mean, Irenaeus is writing around the year 160, and he's a Syrian missionary for Christianity, working in the very rural and barbarian land of France at the time. And he was the first to say, well, there can really be only four Gospels. And then he gives you this wonderful scientific explanation. He says, well, it's because there are four principal winds, there are four corners of the universe. So obviously there can only be four Gospels. And all the others are heresy, and you should avoid them. But Irenaeus was writing about 150 years before Constantine was converted. It was still an illegal movement. He had no military power. He had no social power to implement his convictions. It was only 200 years later when an Egyptian bishop, after Constantine was converted, he would suddenly have military force to say there are only four Gospels. And if you don't sign the creed that Constantine had the bishops write up by committee, the Nicene Creed, you would go into outer darkness. You'd be excluded from the emperor's court. You would be actually effectively consigned to outer darkness, excommunication. So that's an astonishing story, how institutional Christianity got formed. I think it's just, I study history because you can't make up the things that happen. You don't have to. They're astonishing enough.
Right. And it seems to me that talking about, state religion as a mode of political control, I feel like guilt and shame are incredibly powerful methods of social control. And so having a narrative around sin and repentance, original sin, you should feel bad about yourself, but then come to the authorities for repentance. That seems to fit better with the kind of, if it's an imperial mode of dominating people and keeping them under control, that narrative I can imagine serving that function more than the Gnostic kind of, which is more empowering, right? Like discovering for yourself that you are divine. The empowering mode of that seems to fit less with those hierarchical modes of political organization.
Very much so. And that doctrine, as you probably know, I don't know if you saw the book Adam, Eve, and the Serpent. I,
I've not read it
I
yet,
don't,
but it's
I don't
on
know
the
if you've
bookshelf
seen
now.
that one, but well, I was looking at attitudes about sex and politics in early Christianity. Now, people didn't talk about original sin in the second century. Irenaeus didn't. Other Christian leaders, Tertullian, they had a view much more consonant with Judaism, which is that if you're baptized, you can follow Christ, you can do the right thing. Original sin, it doesn't, I can't say that Augustine invented it because there were hints of it before in African Christianity, before he became a bishop, in the 400s. But he created that doctrine. And I wrote about that at the chapter 5 of Adam, Eve, and the Serpent. Um, it's about how Augustine came up with the idea that you, I, everyone essentially is sunk deep in sin. And why? It's because Adam sinned, and that sin of Adam was kind of infected the human race with moral incapacity. Um, I couldn't help thinking of it as a sexually transmitted moral disease because how did humans become infected with it? He says, this is in the City of God books 9 to 11 and 12 to 14. In the City of God, he explains that Adam, we were all in Adam. Adam was a composite human. Other people hadn't thought so. They thought Adam is just a folktale example of a bad example. He chose the wrong thing. You're supposed to choose the right thing. That's what rabbis would say about that story. But he said, no, Adam was a composite person, and he contained the whole human race in himself because he procreated the human race. He's talking quite literally. He's talking biology, as if it were a biological story. So how were we in Adam? We were in the semen. Now, do you know why Jesus was the only human without sin? I mean, is that obvious?
Because he didn't have a human father.
Well, exactly. So if he wasn't conceived the way everyone else was, he was free from sin because Augustine literally says it was transmitted through semen. And that's why the psalmist says, in sin my mother conceived me. I mean, it's astonishing how he combines a biological image with a theological concept. I was staggered. Augustine is a wild writer, but a very powerful one. And this was a very questionable issue in the 4th century. Some people say that Augustine sent 50 Numidian stallions, very prized horses, to the Bishop of Rome to urge him to vote for Augustine's view of original sin. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I've read it in various German monographs. and I asked myself, why did the church accept this really far-fetched teaching instead of the more traditional teaching which it shared with Judaism? And I think it is precisely as you said. If you were an emperor in the 4th century, you could say, well, if everyone's a Christian now, we don't need an army. We don't need police because everyone can now be counted on to behave well once we're baptized Christians. But that's not what happened. People were still acting the same way people act, power hungry and so forth. And And so the idea of original sin, as I suddenly realized, gave you a reason why you would still need a military, you'd still need a police force, you would still need to use force and violence in the state, because humans intrinsically, because of this conception in sin, because of the infection of original sin, would always tend towards sin. So you could never give up, even if you were a Christian emperor, the power of coercion and violence and force and execution. You'd still need it. And so that became an important part of the Holy Roman Empire. It's quite a story. It's where politics and theology meet. And I was really stunned by it. So that's what I wrote the 5th chapter on. And there were some people who don't like this way of looking at it, because it suggests that the political reasons might have overtaken the theological ones. But that is
Yeah.
very possible in this world, as you know.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's extremely well put. The justification of continued domination and coercion and violence, because to me the kind of spiritual impulse is one that's very it's tied up inherently, I think, with self improvement and being empowered and being a better person. And so I can imagine early on the Christian church being incredibly, you know, yeah, having this really positive effect in the world, and then when it becomes a state
Yes.
is religion, there being a significant shift. And I think you described it really beautifully there.
Well, I was thinking of Leon Tolstoy, of course, the great Russian writer, who, when he became a serious Christian, as he did, particularly toward the end of his life, he wrote a famous book called The Kingdom of God is Within You. And then he basically said, well, the message of Christ is the law of love. You have to give up the law of violence. Violence, coercion, execution, military power, police have nothing to do with Christianity. The state should dismantle all of those forms of coercion and, and recognize that the truth of Christ is about the law of love. Well, of course, that doesn't work in politics, although he did influence Mahatma Gandhi when dealing with the British Empire to try a nonviolent approach, because the Indians could not do a military approach. And this idea of nonviolence, of course, then passed on, was very influential for Martin Luther King Jr. in our country when they were dealing with institutionalized racism. Nonviolence was the means that helped crack that legal and violent code of racism. So this has been powerful in history too, but we haven't seen armies and militaries dissolve, obviously.
Right. And it occurs to me that to return to the kind of the main themes of the Gnostic teachings, we haven't really kind of defined what we mean by Gnostic. And to me, I think the etymology is the same for
Yes.
we get knowledge from, right? So it's to do with kind of insight and kind of realization through direct inner experience.
Exactly, and I'm so glad you used that word, because in Greek there are 2 words for knowing. One of them, the most familiar, is the word in Greek "ide," which means to see, to have seen. So idea literally means something you have seen, like a house, a cat, a dog, a person. That's an idea, and you connect it with the word. That's intellectual knowledge, like the knowledge of mathematics or the knowledge of geology or physiology or whatever. But this other word in Greek, gignosko, it means recognize. Like, do you know that person? Do you know yourself? I mean, when Socrates says, know thyself, it's gnothisiato, which the word we get is recognize. It's connected with gnothi. So it's insight. It's not intellectual. It's heart knowledge. And so gnosis, I mean, people say Gnosticism is all about knowing a bunch of secret passwords and crazy doctrines. At least that's what I was taught. But really, it means insight. It means knowledge of the heart. It means knowing your connection with the divine source. And that is an experiential reality, just as we started.
Right. And as you, in Gnostic Gospels, you read about the Gospel of Thomas, and I thought it was fascinating. You were writing about Thomas's name and how it means twin, and an interpretation that kind of evokes that idea that we have the same divinity that Saint Jesus is within us. Would you mind kind of unpacking that for the audience?
Yes, I mean, that's kind of a surprise because it says this is the gospel written by Thomas Didymus, Judas Thomas. This is a character who appears in the Gospel of John, but Thomas is Aramaic nickname for twin, and Didymus is Greek for twin. So this man's name was Judas, but they called him the twin, his nickname in the New Testament. He's not the Judas Iscariot. He's another Judas who's a follower of Jesus. They call him Thomas. And in the Gospel of Thomas, we thought, well, Thomas becomes the interrogator of Jesus who speaks with him and learns from him. And in the Gospel of Thomas, the idea isn't that Jesus had a twin brother, but that you, the disciple, are Thomas. And what you come to discover through reading the Gospel is that you and Jesus, in a way, are twins on a spiritual level, because the divine light is in him. He's illuminated. He understands his connection with the divine source and manifests it. And you, the disciple, or me, the disciple, if we were allowed to be at that point, comes to recognize that we have the same capacity. So in saying 108 in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, whoever drinks from my mouth, which is a metaphor for teaching, whoever accepts my teaching will become like me, and I will become that person, and the mysteries will be revealed to them. Now that's heresy, right? Because in the Catholic Church, for you to say, you're like Jesus, that's really blasphemy. You can't be like Jesus. He's the Son of God and you're not. That's the basic teaching, right? You need him for your salvation, otherwise you're lost. But this teaching says, no, we all come from that place through creation, and we can discover that we have that access, and then we can become like him in that sense. And so it's a very different message. No wonder the church said it was heresy.
Right, and isn't there also the Gospel of Philip? There's a quote I read in your book. I think it was something like, don't just become a Christian, but try to become a Christos.
Yes, and Christos, of course, means anointed. So it's talking about baptism. It says, okay, be baptized. And when you're baptized, we'll put oil on your head and we'll anoint you with oil. And once you're anointed, you are a Christos, because that's what the word Messiah means. It means anointed. It's just the Hebrew for the Greek word Christos. But what the Gospel of Philip, similarly, like Thomas, it says Jesus had a human father and a human mother, Joseph and Mary, just as everyone else does. But when you are baptized, as the Gospel of John says, you can become the children of God, the Father. And you can also become the children of the Divine Mother, which is the name for the Holy Spirit. So you can become not only the child of your biological parents, but also you can become the child of God and the child of the Holy Spirit through baptism. These divine names are said over you when you're baptized and anointed in the name of the Father and the Spirit and the Son. So it's about being baptized. And then you too are a Christos, anointed and the Son of God, the Son of the Holy Spirit. That again would be heresy in any Catholic teaching.
Right. I mean, I feel like it's not entirely uncommon to see people who have these experiences where they feel like they are the second coming of Jesus, and usually they're just kind of wheeled out and ridiculed on television. Um, but I think psychologically, the thing that this points to, the recognition of this spiritual truth that can be found within all of us, and the power of Jesus as a figure. I think, yeah, I think people are tapping into a really powerful psychological process that can get derailed into mental health issues. But yeah, I think it's something very real. This idea of realizing that there's something in you that is like Jesus, or at least aspiring. You know, what would Jesus do now? Is a kind of it's treated as a kind of trivial bumper sticker, but I think it's quite a profound way to live one's life.
I think you bring up a very important issue. That's why mystical teaching is not taught to everybody. There is such a thing in Jerusalem. I don't know if you've been there, but it's called the Jerusalem syndrome. Do you know about this? The
No,
Jerusalem syndrome is when somebody arrives and says, I'm Jesus, I'm the Messiah. And this happens often enough to have people taken to mental hospitals because they think they're Jesus of Nazareth, they're Jesus Christ. And I think it happens to a lot of Americans, I've been told. So this is called the Jerusalem syndrome. It's obviously mental illness in the sense that they mean I am the one. I'm the only one.
right.
I'm the right one. I'm Jesus. But the Gospel of Thomas doesn't teach that. It says that everyone who comes to recognize the connection with God is that. There's nothing unique about it. It's a gift, a divine gift that we all could discover, but which many of us are unaware of. So that's really quite different. And and yes, it can look a lot like mental illness, but it's really it's quite different. And that's why the mystical traditions have always been quite carefully protected from people who are taking them in a naive way.
And then I guess in this picture, Jesus is more of a kind of spiritual teacher guiding us to discover our own divinity rather than a kind of a distant gatekeeper of divinity.
Yes, or the soul gatekeeper. That's not
Right.
what this is about. This is about when you are when you discover who you really are spiritually, then that is what the kingdom of God means. That's what the Gospel of Thomas teaches. So I found this very exciting to realize that there were these teachings at the beginning of the Christian movement, and they were simply shut down. Um, Even when I was studying at Oxford for a year from graduate school, I was very much discouraged from studying those texts by my mentor, who was a major figure in the Anglican Church, Christ Church,
Oh well.
Christ Church College.
Oh well. Um, and then the
That's
phrase "the
just
king."
that's just typical.
So the phrase of the kingdom of heaven being within you, is that something from the Gnostic Gospels, or is that a bit of Gnosticism that slipped into the canonical texts?
I don't know if it's Gnosticism. It's said to
Yeah.
be a saying of Jesus. And it is in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 17:21, and it's also in the Gospel of Thomas. So I wouldn't say it's a Gnostic teaching, but it's a teaching of Jesus that's interpreted in various ways. And you're right. And Matthew, too, at one point has Jesus say, You are the light of the world. He doesn't say, I am the light of the world. That's in John. He says, You are the light of the world. So there are those hints in the Gospels in the New Testament, but they're mostly reserved for teaching in smaller groups, which Jesus apparently did, and Paul did as well.
Right. And then we mentioned earlier this idea that these references to the idea of the kingdom of heaven, it comes at the end, but the end I think it's the end is the beginning. There's one statement, and we spoke earlier about this idea of the kingdom of heaven being the thing that existed before anything existed, which it very much reminds me of Taoism. I think there's this there's a kind of Zen koan that comes out of that tradition that it's I think it's what is the face you had before you were born that I always find kind of evokes this feeling of me
Yes,
of
yes.
this, and it seems very similar to that. And also the Tao translates as the way, and you have Jesus saying, "I am the way." There's a few parallels there, it seems.
There certainly are. In fact, not only does Jesus say, I'm the way in the Gospel of John, but the Christian path was called, they called Christianity hados, which means the road, the way. This was a way before it was a set of beliefs. It was a way to live. It was a way to treat people. It was a way to experience a relationship with God and other people and the world and everything, right? Before it was a set of dogmas. And that's what I love about studying this early movement, because you see that there was a lot more diversity and range in the early Christian movement than was ever transmitted. What was came down as Orthodox tradition is a sort of narrow stream, but it was a wider movement in the beginning. And to create an Orthodox church and claim it's the only way, you have to suppress all of the other options that accompanied it much earlier.
Right. And on the kind of topic of, I guess, the mystical experience, it's often an experience of oneness or a kind of unitive experience. And there was a quote that I wrote down from the Gnostic Gospels. There was, whoever is from one will be filled with light. Whoever is divided will be filled with darkness. And I thought that was a nice kind of pointing to the fact that this oneness and this illumination, this kind of divine light, go together. I thought that was just quite a nice. You see all of these classical aspects of mysticism referenced in the Gnostic Gospels, it seems.
You do. That's exactly right. It's about probably the idea that the primordial creation is a spiritual one, as Taoism suggests.
And was there some possibility of a Buddhist influence of these Gospels? I think I read in your book about kind of trade routes to India at the time, that there may have been some connection.
That's an interesting question. It's hard to trace, because I was just teaching a course with a colleague at Princeton called Jesus and Buddha, and my colleague is a specialist in 11th and 15th century Tibetan Buddhism. And, Buddhism the Buddha lived 400 years or so before Jesus. And in the first century, when Christian traditions were being written down, Buddhist traditions were being written down about the life of the Buddha. And they were well known in Egypt. And once you read the fathers of the church talking about heretics, some of them, Hippolytus of Rome, for example, in about 160, says, oh, and there are these heretics, these naked Indians sitting by the Ganges meditating. They're heretics too. So they knew about Buddhists. In fact, another Clement of Alexandria, Christian teacher in Alexandria in Egypt, 2nd century also, says, yes, and they're the Buddha, and some people thought he was a divine being. So we don't know how much of Buddhist teaching could have infiltrated, but it's interesting that the Gospel of Thomas is attributed to Thomas, whom tradition says is the disciple who went to India. And there is a church of St. Thomas in Kerala, in India, which claims to have been built on the grave of the apostle Thomas after he went to India. So these teachings could have gone to India. And some people say, well, did Jesus go to India? I don't think it's likely for a village rabbi. But the teachings certainly could have gone and been influenced by Buddhist and Hindu teachings. And one feels that kind of influence in some of these sources. But I don't think it can be demonstrably shown, because we just don't have hard evidence of that. There are just hints about
it. Right.
At this point, maybe there'll be another discovery.
Yeah. And on the point of the kind of unitive worldview, reading around this, people seem to routinely say that the Gnostic perspective is quite dualistic. There's quite a split between the spirit and the body. The body is seen as something kind of to be negated and the material world as a kind of negative thing. Is that right?
Well, the thing is, there's no single kind of Gnostic view. I mean, all of these texts got lumped together because they were found together and they were all agreed to be sort of heresy from the church's point of view. But there are different sources. Some of them do talk about a radical split between the spirit and flesh. And that's very much part of ancient tradition. It comes out of Platonism. So some of these texts sound that way. The ones that I like best, though, James, are the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the round dance of the cross, come from a tradition from the teacher called Valentinus. And that is extremely monistic. There's no idea of dualism at all. In fact, I was just talking to someone whose background is Hindu, who was brought up Roman Catholic. And I said, this sounds Indian to me. And she said, what do you mean Indian? And I said, there's no separation between the material and the spiritual, that these are part of the same reality. Like when Jesus says, I am the light, and split a piece of wood and I am there, lift up a rock and you will find me. That is, the material and the spiritual are understood as part of the same reality. And that's very different. So I would say some sources are dualistic. The ones I find most interesting come from a tradition that is distinctly monistic.
Right. I mean, we mentioned that you think there could be an influence of Jewish mysticism here and potentially even Buddhism. And you just mentioned ancient Greek thinking. Is that a possibility as well, that kind of ancient Greek religious traditions also had an influence?
Oh, yes. People do notice that in some of the texts, not the ones I've been talking about, it looks like there's Platonic influence, and Manichaean Christianity did talk about an extreme dualism between the material and spiritual worlds. And Marcionite Christianity, which was an early Christian heresy, split those entirely. Said God could not have created the material world, somebody else did, is a lesser being. And that kind of negative teaching was actually projected by some of the fathers of the church onto all of these secret teachings. So they ignored the ones that were monistic to sort of, it's like saying in our country that if you're a Republican, that Democrats are basically communists, or saying the same thing about Republicans. You just sort of tar them with the same brush and people will think they're that bad.
That's really interesting because I got that impression as I was reading around this. So I read several places where it kind of just asserted that the Gnostic perspective is one of, so I think it was that you have the monad, which is the kind of the unitive source, mystical kind of energy, divine energy of the universe that you might call God. And then that splits off into beings called aeons, one of which I think it was called a demiurge, which is the God of the Old Testament, but that was a negative figure who had imprisoned our perfect spirits in a kind of, the material world's this prison. And I mean, having raised Christian, it seems it's very radical to be given this perspective in which the creator God is actually the kind of the villain of the story. But that's interesting to know that there are different schools, that they didn't all have the same perspective.
That is the heresy of a teacher called Marcion, who was a teacher in the 2nd century, roundly denounced by Christians who had a much more benign view of the God of Israel. But it was branded as a heresy of Marcion, and then it was taken up later by the prophet Mani, who was a Christian, but he saw Christianity in those starkly negative terms, so that essentially sexuality was prohibited to those who would be perfect. Eating any kind of food, any kind of alcohol that was not strictly vegetarian was also seen as demeaning, and you were supposed to purify, become as ethereal as you possibly could in this world. And that is a strain of Christianity that is really a minor strain, but some people identified it with what they called Gnosticism before we found these texts. If you read the book called The Gnostic Religion by Hans Jonas, I don't know if you've seen it. It's a very influential book. It's a beautifully written book. He was a German Jewish scholar who studied New Testament in Germany before the war and published that book in 1934 called Gnosis und Spätantiker Geist. And he saw it as this kind of dualism. But that view of so-called Gnosticism changed when we found an actual library, which gives us a much more complex picture.
Right. I mean, that image where there's more than one deity, it makes me think of, as an adult, when I read Genesis for the first time, I was struck by, in the translations I found, there were phrases about things like, I think it was "let us make mankind in our image" instead of in my image, and I wasn't sure if that was the kind of the royal we almost, as a way of speaking, or if there's like a, yeah, I've just never heard it mentioned actually. This isn't necessarily about Gnosticism, but since we were mentioning these alternate theological views of deities, is there a standard interpretation of why that there seems to be a reference to other deities there?
Yes, it is a plural in Hebrew. And interestingly, in the first chapter of Genesis, the name of God, Elohim, in Hebrew, is a plural. El is the name of God, right? Elohim is plural, the gods. If you're reading Hebrew, you could say the gods. But essentially, whatever Hebrew-speaking people wrote that story down, scribes, probably in the court of King David, said, you talk about the gods. Well, the gods are our God. And that God can speak in plural because it